The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus, but the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them he addressed this parable. "What man among you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, would not leave the 99 in the desert and go after the lost one until he finds it? And when he does find it, he sets it on his shoulders with great joy. And upon his arrival home, he calls together his friends and neighbors and says to them, 'Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep.' I tell you, in just the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who have no need of repentance. Or what woman, having 10 coins and losing one, would not light a lamp and sweep the house, searching carefully until she finds it? And when she does find it, she calls together her friends and neighbors and says to them, 'Rejoice with me, because I have found the coin that I lost.' In just the same way, I tell you, there will be rejoicing among the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Then he said, "A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me.' So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, 'How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But his father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast. Because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' Then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, 'Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughtered the fattened calf.' He said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I must confess that I didn't do very much to prepare for this homily, because it seems like every spare hour that I had this week, I was in the basement painting the CCD classrooms, and so the homily was sort of on the back burner this week. So I'm going to go back to the well on this one. Unfortunately, we just had this gospel reading a few months ago during Lent. It was the 4th Sunday of Lent, where we heard the same gospel passage of the prodigal son. So what I'm about to say might sound rather familiar because you would have heard it just a few months ago, but perhaps you weren't here, or perhaps this gospel will speak to you in a different way today than it did back in the spring. This is a very rich parable with many layers, so we need to unravel those layers sort of line by line in order to really understand what it is that Jesus is telling us. So at the beginning, the parable begins, a man had 2 sons. So the first 2 words, a man, that's the main character of the story, the father. And he is the main character in the story in several different ways. This parable is usually called the parable of the prodigal son. The son, prodigal is a word that means wasteful. And the son goes off and wastes his father's inheritance. But really, if you were to accurately title this parable, it's more about the father. I think it would be better to call this parable the parable of the merciful father. Because he's the main character, and that is sort of the point that Jesus is trying to make in this parable. It's not really about the son, it's about the father. And it's pretty obvious that the father in this story represents God the Father. And we need to keep that in mind as we move on. So the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me a share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. In other words, the younger son is basically saying, "Dad, can we just pretend that you're dead already and you can give me the money that I'm supposed to inherit and get my share of the will?" And it tells us how little he cares about his father. What he cares about is the money. And he's not even patient enough to wait for it. So he's basically saying, "Look, I want to take my money and leave rather than spend another day with you, Dad." Now, most of us, I don't know, would write that son out of our will, saying, "Here, your share is $0." But the father doesn't, and that should get our attention. At any time when we're listening to the parables of Jesus, if there's something strange about the parable, then we have to pay attention to that strangeness. So if something doesn't add up, then that's sort of the point of the parable. And the strangest here is that the father doesn't react in accordance with the son's behavior. He doesn't write his son out of his will. Instead, he freely gives him exactly what he asked for. Why would he do that? Maybe it's because I don't have children and I'm not able to understand that level of love that a parent has for their child. Perhaps most parents would react the way that the father in the story does react. Just give him his inheritance and move on. But the father doesn't even get angry or frustrated with his son. The father doesn't even indicate that his feelings are being hurt or that he's offended. To me, that's remarkable and that's strange, and so it's worth paying attention to. God, the Father, is represented by this father, so it's telling us something remarkable about our Heavenly Father. God always gives us, even when what we want isn't what we need, He always sort of meets us where we're at in life. He never forces Himself on us. God never expects too much of us. He wants us to freely choose Him. And so, often we don't choose Him because we like the way things are. We like living comfortable lives, the world that we've sort of built for ourselves. And so we don't want to change. We don't want things to change. And we feel like being, staying on the same course, being stuck in our ways is cozy. There's less uncertainty, there's less fear. And we fail to recognize that if God is asking us to change, it is a plan that is far better for us, that will lead to something more fulfilling than anything we can imagine. And yet, God doesn't force that on us. He meets us where we are. If we're not ready to take that next step to grow closer to God, then He'll wait for us. He doesn't expect us to be perfect tomorrow. He gives Himself to us in little doses so that we wouldn't be overwhelmed by Him. So the father in the parable, he probably understands that arguing with his son at this point is not going to accomplish anything. And I would imagine that as parents, there would be a temptation to want to control every aspect of your child's life in order to protect them from all harm. And of course, you start off their life doing that to protect them from all that could go wrong. And in many ways, that's a very good thing. But sometimes, especially as people grow older, letting someone figure things out for themselves is a more valuable lesson. Sometimes that's the best kind of love. In some cases, it is difficult to understand what people are trying to tell us, what our parents are trying to tell us, and until we realize the exact same thing through, discovering it for ourselves. And so, knowing that his son had to learn a hard lesson, the father in the parable gives him his inheritance and sends him on his way. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens who sent him to his farm to tend the swine, and he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. And it's sort of the way the life goes, I guess. This turn of events that can help us understand sort of stages in our lives. The journey for the young man has led him to a life of sin and selfishness, and that sin takes him further and further away from the home of his father and his major concerns in this new lifestyle that he has decided to choose for himself. His major concerns of self-gratification and self-centered lifestyle, it's gotten him nowhere. None of the relationships that he establishes are lasting. He finds himself alone when his money runs out, so do his friends. And there he is in a pig pen, which, if you kind of read it in context, Jesus is a Jew talking to Jewish people. Pigs were considered disgusting animals. They were considered unclean. So this was an image of the lowest of the low, the worst you can get in life. He was mired in the mud of a pig pen just as much he was mired in sin. And I'm sure we've all had a moment in our life, perhaps not as drastic as the son in the parable, where we've kind of stepped back and asked ourselves, how did I get here? What am I doing? And oftentimes the answer to that question has to do with the sins of our youth, with the hard lessons we growing up, or that we learn growing up, which is often part of our journey back to God. And that's, the real tragedy in it all. The real tragedy of this parable is that the son doesn't recognize the goodness of his father. He doesn't know how good he has it until he loses everything, because he never took time to know his father. And we all run the risk of doing that, especially when we first have to make it out on our own as young adults. If we don't take the time to know God and to learn our faith, then we will be mesmerized by the pagan world around us. We'll be sucked up into it. I hear from parents and grandparents all the time that they tell me sad stories about how their children and grandchildren no longer practice their faith, but that's the world we live in. When our children are not immersed in the truth of God, when they aren't taught how good the Father is, then they don't really know who God is. And the whole religion thing seems like a waste of time. And then when they leave home and there's glamour of the hypersexualized and consumeristic and me-first, self-centered culture around them, well, that's very tempting. And once we begin to go down that road, it's very hard to turn around and go back to God. So if we don't talk about the goodness of God, and especially if we don't show them the goodness of God, then no wonder so many young people leave the church. If I didn't experience for myself God's love for me, I'd find something to better do with my time. Why in the world would I bother with being Catholic and all that includes? But what if the first thing that I ever learned about God was that He is good, that He loves me, that God wants what is best for me, and that is something that I kept in my heart all the time, that I knew truly. It wasn't just something that was told to me, it was something that I know absolutely. Maybe that's the message we need to lead with when we're teaching our faith to our children. But still, even when we do that, the world is the world, and It's very enticing, even when we have been taught perfectly well who God is and how much he loves us. In fact, sometimes we have to hit rock bottom and perhaps dig even a deeper bottom before we come to our senses, and that is the turning point. Coming to his senses, he thought, how many of my father's hired workers have far more than enough food to eat, but here I am dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers. So he got up and went back to his father. The younger son goes back, thinking, expecting somehow to repay his father for his sins, for his betrayal. And I think we do that more often than we really think. If we self-reflect, we do things out of obligation, as if we can do enough things to earn our way into God's good graces, or pass the test to get into heaven, something like that. We negotiate with God. If I do this, then please do this for me. Or if you do this one thing, God, then I promise I will do this for the rest of my life. That sort of thing. And we aim to repair our relationship with God, or even with our neighbor, as if we're the ones that are actually doing the fixing, as if we're the ones in control. And you'll see in the parable, that's not how God works. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. But his father ordered his servants, quickly bring the finest robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. Then the celebration began. So like I said, the son thought that he had to earn his way back into his father's love. But the truth is that he had never lost his father's love. Instead of losing his father's love, the son rejected his father's love. And there's a big difference. He didn't know his father. He didn't understand his father's love. He thought that he would have to be one of his servants. But instead, his father is there waiting for him. It says in the gospel that he saw him from a long way off, which would lead us to believe that he was waiting for him, searching for him, looking for him to come back against all odds, never taking his eyes off the horizon. The father kept watch for his son, even when people probably thought that he was a fool for doing so. That son of yours, he's never coming back. And if he did, why would you want him back? He never stopped loving his son, and he showers him with gifts. The finest clothes, a ring on his finger, and a feast. God will humble you. He will embarrass you with his love. His love is beyond what is right and what is wrong. His love is beyond doing justice to those who deserve justice. His love is even beyond human reason. In fact, it is unreasonable how much God loves us. He will love you even when you think you don't deserve his love. He'll love you to the point that his goodness will leave you feeling sheepish. He'll treat you like a king or a queen, whether you deserve it or not. He'll shower you with so many gifts that you'll be angry that you ever thought of life without him. God will teach you that there is nothing that you can do to make him stop loving you. He'll wait for you the second that you leave him, and continue waiting until he sees you return. And when you do, the blinding light of his love for you will leave you feeling like a fool. I have a friend, told this story before a few times, but his dad left his family, left the church, and for 20 years he was gone, broke their hearts in their home, and just caused a lot of problems. He ran off with a woman the same age as his oldest son. And after 20 years, he wanted to come back and be reconciled to the church. His ex-wife, my friend's mother had already gotten an annulment so he could come back into the church, and the woman that he had remarried with, they got divorced as well. And so he asked his son, what do I have to do to get back? And my friend said, Dad, just go to confession. That's it. That's it. That's it. With God, you'll have your definition of goodness redefined, because any good that you thought you knew will not only be dwarfed, but obliterated by the power of his mercy. The son in the story is left speechless. The son hasn't even explained himself yet, and the father forgives him and loves him because the father is good. And God is forgiveness and mercy itself. Finally, there's the last part of the story, which is probably the most important part of the story for us. The older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of his servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. He became angry. When he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, look, all these years I've served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, you swallowed up your property with prostitutes. For him you slaughter the fattened calf. He said to him, my son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. I say this is probably the most important part of the story for us, because perhaps a lot of us can't relate to the younger brother. You say, Father, I haven't completely abandoned my faith like that clown, or my family like the prodigal son. I've been faithful my whole life. I go to church. I haven't killed anybody. I haven't stolen anything. I don't lie. I don't cheat. Or maybe you say, Father, I can't relate to the younger brother because any past guilt that I might have had, that was so long ago in my past. I'm a new person. How does this parable apply to me now? And the answer is the older son. If you can't relate at this point in your life to the younger son, try to relate to the older son. Perhaps we have committed his sins. The older brother is jealous. You treat him like a king. Why? He deserves to be punished. It's ridiculous. Here I am working hard, and you reward this guy? If we find ourselves looking at other people and wondering, why do they get it so easy? If we think, why in the world does that person deserve that? If we think, I work way harder for what I have than that person. I wish I had it that easy. I wish I had a house like theirs, or their good health. I wish I had a family like that. If we find ourselves thinking those things, or saying those things, or gossiping about those things, talking about others when they aren't around, even if what we're saying is true, then we are the older son. You see, you don't have to be the scum of the earth to be the prodigal son. The older son is just as prodigal. He's just as wasteful. Because the older brother makes the same mistake as the younger brother. He doesn't know his father. He's lived with his father all these years, and so perhaps he commits the worst sin of the two. Because even though he's with his dad, he misses the entire point. He thinks that the father's love is earned by good behavior. But that isn't love. That's a reward. That isn't love, because that's not how God works. Love isn't earned. It's only freely given. And so, this week, go into it seeing either of the son's tendencies in ourselves and turning our mind, instead of toward those things that we can complain about, toward God himself. To remind ourselves that we are loved unconditionally. That there is nothing that we could ever do that would make God stop loving you. That you'll never, ever overestimate God's love for you and God's mercy. And responding to that love, that's the part that's up to us. Because like the sons, we can either accept it or reject it. Do we reject that love like the younger son? Sometimes it's hard to allow ourselves to be loved. Sometimes we don't feel like we deserve it. Or Or we, like the younger son, the older son, we take that love for granted. Sometimes it's so easy to want to be recognized and congratulated for doing what is right. Sometimes it's easy to cast pity or to look down on sinners as lost soul. Sometimes it's easy to desire to see people get what they deserve. But either way, we need to avoid both temptations of the two sons and come to truly know our Father's love.